When they cut me off for choosing love, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just smiled. Because I knew something they didn't. For 12 years, I was the good daughter. The one who showed up early, stayed late, and never complained. I helped build our family business from the ground up. I handled the books, the clients, the chaos, all while they took the credit. I thought loyalty meant love. I thought family meant forever. But the day I told them I was marrying Evan, a man they said was beneath our name, everything changed. My father's eyes turned cold. My mother's silence became a weapon. And my brother, well, he just smirked. Within a week, my name was erased from the company records. My key card stopped working. My desk was cleared. They said, "If you choose him, you choose a life without us." So I did. What they didn't know was that the same woman they dismissed, the one they called naive and emotional, had quietly learned every corner of the empire they thought they owned. Every clause, every contract, every weak spot. When they shut the door, I didn't see loss. I saw opportunity. Because love didn't make me weaker. It made me unstoppable. And one day soon, they'd all be clocking into a company that no longer belonged to them. My name is Jessica, and this is how I turned betrayal into the best business deal of my life. My name is Jessica Monroe, and for most of my life, I believed that hard work and loyalty could fix anything. My father, Richard Monroe, built Monroe Industrial Solutions from a small, dusty workshop into one of the largest construction supply firms in the Midwest. My mother, Patricia, ran the office side, meticulous, polite, the perfect image of control. And my older brother, Daniel, was the heir apparent, the business brain, who was supposed to take the company to the next level. Then there was me, the quiet one, the helper, the daughter who handled the paperwork, the vendors, the financial compliance, and the late-night calls no one else wanted to take. I didn't mind. Not at first. I thought if I just worked harder, if I proved myself, maybe my father would see me as more than the backup child. When I graduated from business school, I didn't take the easy route. I didn't ask for a management title or a corner office. I started at the bottom. Payroll assistant, $12 an hour, barely enough to cover gas. My father said it was character building. My mother told me it was humility training. Daniel just smirked, like he knew I'd never get far enough to challenge him. But I stayed. I learned. I built systems from scratch, fixed the books when others messed up, and caught the mistakes that could have cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars. My father never thanked me for it, but he noticed. I saw it in the small nods during meetings, the rare, almost proud look when clients complimented my efficiency. That was enough for me back then. Outside of work, I didn't have much of a life. Most of my friends moved away after college. Dating felt impossible. Every man I met seemed intimidated by my drive or too fragile to handle my ambition. Then I met Evan. Evan worked for a local nonprofit that built homes for low-income families. He wasn't flashy, didn't wear expensive suits or drive luxury cars. But he had something my family never valued: kindness. He listened. He asked questions that made me think. He respected me. We met at a charity event my company sponsored. I remember my father dismissing him afterward. "That guy's not in our league," he said. I laughed it off then, thinking it was just his usual arrogance. But I had no idea that one simple relationship would later split my family apart. Evan and I started dating quietly. At first, I didn't even tell my parents. He wasn't part of the corporate world they lived in. He wore jeans with holes, not tailored suits. He spoke about purpose, not profit. But the more time I spent with him, the more I realized how toxic my family's version of success really was. He saw how exhausted I was. He'd tell me, "Jess, you give them everything. When do you give yourself something?" I didn't have an answer. Still, I was loyal. When my brother made a poor investment that drained nearly $200,000 from our reserves, I covered it quietly. I shuffled funds, balanced reports, and saved him from embarrassment. He never thanked me. He just said, "Good job cleaning up my mess, sis." When the company got audited 2 years later, it was me, not Daniel, who saved us again. I found discrepancies in old supplier contracts, rewrote them, and presented the findings so neatly that even the auditors called it impressive crisis management. My father said, "You've done well, Jessica. Keep at it." That was the highest praise I'd ever received. In return, I gave him everything. My 20s, my weekends, my dreams. So when Evan proposed, I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd see the man I saw. A man who reminded me of what life outside spreadsheets and boardrooms felt like. I brought him to a family dinner one Friday night. The silence was heavy from the start. My mother's smile was polite, but her eyes scanned his suit like she was evaluating a thrift store purchase. Daniel barely looked up from his phone. My father asked Evan about his job, and when he said he worked for a nonprofit, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "A nonprofit?" my father repeated, voice thick with disdain. "So, you don't make money?" Evan smiled. "We build homes for families who can't afford them. Money's not the goal. Stability is." My father chuckled, the way you do when someone tells you something naive. "Well, that's noble," he said. "But in this family, stability comes from money." The dinner ended early. The next morning, I got a text from my mother. "Your father is disappointed. We'll talk later." That talk turned into an interrogation. My father told me Evan was using me. My mother said he was beneath my upbringing. Daniel just called him charity boy. And when I refused to break things off, the tone changed. "You're free to make your own choices," my father said. "But remember, choices have consequences." The consequence came 3 weeks later, an email from HR. "Your position is being restructured effective immediately." I thought it was a mistake. But when I tried to log into my company email, access denied. When I drove to the office, my keycard beeped red. My nameplate was gone. That's when it hit me. They'd cut me off completely. No warning, no conversation. Just exile. My savings were small because every extra dollar I'd earned, I'd reinvested into the company. I didn't even have health insurance outside of the corporate plan. For a few weeks, I felt lost. Evan was the one who held me together, whispering late at night, "You didn't lose them, Jess. You just found out who they really are." He was right. Because underneath the heartbreak, a slow-burning fire began to grow. I started replaying every board meeting, every contract, every offhand comment. I realized how much I actually knew, not just about our finances, but about our vulnerabilities. I'd spent 12 years learning how to protect the company. Maybe it was time to learn how to use that knowledge for myself. At the time, I didn't know how it would all unfold. But looking back, that was the moment I stopped being the obedient daughter. That was the moment I became something else, something stronger. Because when family betrays you, you can let it break you, or you can let it build you. And I was done breaking. It's strange how betrayal rarely comes like thunder. Loud, dramatic, impossible to ignore. Sometimes it's quiet, surgical. You don't even feel the knife until you see the blood. That's how my family betrayed me. After they fired me, I tried to convince myself it was temporary, a heated decision they'd walk back once they cooled off. I told myself my father was just angry, my mother torn between loyalty and love. I even convinced myself that Daniel had nothing to do with it. I was wrong. It started small. One day, I got a call from a former coworker, an accountant I'd trained years ago. She said, "Jess, I thought you'd know. Daniel told everyone you stole from the company. My breath caught. What? Yeah. He said that's why your position was terminated. He said there was an internal review and that you were caught manipulating expense accounts. I felt my hands go numb. Me, the one who'd saved them from multiple audits, being called a thief? The worst part was, I couldn't even defend myself. My access was gone, my name erased. They'd deleted every trace of my work. That night, I sat on the floor of our small apartment, my laptop open, staring at the company's public records. I knew those systems like the back of my hand. I'd built half of them myself. And there it was, a new corporate structure, updated the same day I was fired. My father as CEO, Daniel as executive vice president, and a new clause added to the partnership terms, one that dissolved any prior profit-sharing agreements. That clause was my signature work, a safety measure I'd proposed years earlier to protect the company from outside investors. I'd written it, revised it, perfected it, and now it was being used against me. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house. It was early, 6:30 a.m. The smell of coffee hit me the second I walked in. My mother was at the kitchen table, scrolling through her tablet like nothing had happened. "Mom," I said, voice shaking. "Why did you tell people I stole?" She didn't look up. We didn't tell anyone. Daniel may have said something out of context. You know how rumors start. Out of context? I snapped. You erased me from the company records and replaced me with him. You think that's out of context? Her expression didn't change. Your father made a decision that was best for the business. You're emotional right now. Maybe this time away will give you perspective. Perspective. That word echoed in my head long after I left the house. A week later, I saw my father at a local trade event, the kind of thing I used to organize. He was shaking hands, laughing with suppliers, bragging about new contracts. When our eyes met, he smiled, a small, polite smile, the kind you give a stranger. "Jessica," he said evenly. "Good to see you." I wanted to scream, to ask him why, to remind him of every hour I'd given to his empire. But instead I just stood there, frozen. He leaned closer and said softly, "You chose your path. Jess, don't come crying when it gets hard." Then he walked away. That was the last time I saw him as my father. After that, the fallout came fast. Our shared family friends stopped calling. Clients I'd worked with for years refused to return my messages. One of them, a contractor named Harris, finally told me the truth. "Jessica, they told us you were involved in something shady. They said you were suing them." Suing them? They weren't just cutting me off. They were destroying my reputation. I realized then that this wasn't just punishment for choosing love. It was an erasure, complete and deliberate. My father didn't want me to just leave. He wanted me to disappear, and Daniel? He was thriving. Social media posts showed him at networking events, signing deals, shaking hands with executives I'd personally recruited. He'd taken everything I built and slapped his name on it. Every post, every photo, every smile was another twist of the knife. But the real betrayal came 2 months later. Evan and I were starting to rebuild. I was freelancing, doing financial consulting for small businesses. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. One afternoon, Evan came home holding an envelope. "It's from Monroe Industrial," he said, confused. Inside was a legal notice, a cease and desist order. They were accusing me of using proprietary company materials in my consulting work. It was absurd. I hadn't touched a single document from them since I was fired. But they claimed I'd copied methods and templates that were intellectual property. I could barely breathe. They weren't satisfied with ruining my name. Now they wanted to crush my future too. I called their lawyer, a man I'd worked with for years. And he said flatly, "Jessica, I'm sorry. Your father's orders are clear. This isn't personal," but it was personal. Every bit of it. I hung up and stared at the papers. My hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from something sharper. Clarity. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd cut me off, humiliated me, and left me powerless. But they forgot one thing. In those 12 years of being the helper, I'd learned every secret of their business, every flaw in their contracts, every debt they'd hidden, every favor they owed. I knew the company better than anyone, including my father. And while they were busy celebrating their victory, I was already seeing the cracks forming. The firm was overextended. Too many new contracts, not enough liquidity. Daniel was signing deals to impress investors, but the profit margins were paper thin. I'd warned them about it before, but they hadn't listened. Now, watching from the outside, I saw exactly how and when it would fall apart. That's when I stopped crying. That's when the heartbreak turned into focus. They'd taken everything from me, my job, my name, my family. But they'd also given me something they didn't mean to, the blueprint to destroy them. They thought I'd go quietly, I told Evan one night. They were wrong. He looked at me, not scared, but proud. What are you going to do? I smiled for the first time in weeks. I'm going to build something better. And when they come knocking, I'll be the one signing their paychecks. He laughed softly, not realizing I meant every word. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I whispered to myself, they messed with the wrong person. And for the first time since it all began, I believed it. The day I found my leverage began like any other. Gray morning light filtering through our thin curtains. Coffee bubbling weekly in a cheap machine Evan had picked up at a thrift store. It had been months since my family exiled me, and though the ache was still there, it had hardened into something different. Focus. I was working on a consulting proposal for a local contracting company when I noticed something familiar in their supplier list. Monroe Industrial Solutions. My heart skipped. They were one of the main distributors for building materials in our region. Seeing their name printed across an invoice was like running into an X at the grocery store. Unexpected and uncomfortable. But then I noticed something strange. The invoice was misdated. It said net 60 days, but the purchase order number format was off, different from the system I had created years ago. I knew that format like a signature, and this wasn't it. My curiosity got the better of me. I called the contractor, pretending it was part of due diligence. Hey, this invoice. Did you get a confirmation from Monroe directly? The guy sighed. Yeah, but it's been a mess. Their deliveries have been delayed for weeks. Daniel said they were transitioning systems, whatever that means. That phrase, transitioning systems, told me everything. Daniel was trying to change the internal accounting infrastructure, probably to cover up liquidity problems or debt mismanagement. I'd warned him years ago not to touch those systems without a complete audit, and if he'd ignored that advice, he'd made a mistake. That night, after Evan went to bed, I opened my old external hard drive, the one I'd backed up religiously during my years at the company. I'd never opened it since leaving, mostly because I didn't want to relive that part of my life. But now I plugged it in and held my breath as the blue light flickered on. Folders appeared. Hundreds of them. Payroll reports, compliance records, vendor logs, internal memos. My pulse quickened. These weren't stolen documents. They were my backups, created legally as part of my job. But they were also filled with information no one else had anymore. I scrolled through old financial audits, purchase orders, and quarterly reports, until something caught my eye. A confidential memo dated 2 months before I was fired. It was from our corporate lawyer, addressed to my father and Daniel. The subject line read, Profit Distribution Proposal, Internal Adjustment for Partnership Transfer. The memo explained that my father planned to restructure the company so that, upon his eventual retirement, Daniel would receive majority control. 70%, while I'd get 15%, and the remaining 15% would be distributed among junior partners. But there was a line near the bottom that stopped me cold. Per Jessica's suggestion during our 2018 compliance review, the restructuring requires unanimous consent from all current officers of record to take effect. Unanimous consent. That meant me. I was still an officer of record at the time the memo was written. And according to the legal timestamp, they never obtained my digital signature on the new structure, which meant their new ownership model. The one that erased me completely might be invalid. My breath caught in my throat. Opened the corporate registration site for the state. My father had filed the new paperwork 2 days after I was fired. But if he filed without proper authorization from an active officer, the filing could be challenged, even reversed. And if reversed, ownership would revert to the last valid structure. The one where I still owned 30% of a multi-million-dollar company. My hands were shaking. For a long moment, I sat there in silence, staring at the glowing screen. It wasn't revenge yet, but it was the spark, the seed, the proof that I still had power. I whispered to myself, "They forgot I know how every corner of this house is built." Over the next week, I double-checked everything. I contacted an independent lawyer, someone I trusted from my consulting network. Her name was Nora Alvarez, a quiet but fierce woman who specialized in corporate law. We met at a coffee shop downtown. She skimmed through the documents, then looked up at me with raised eyebrows. "Jessica, if this is all accurate, and it looks like it is, your family's restructure wasn't legally compliant. You could file for reinstatement of your partnership rights. What would that mean?" I asked carefully. She smiled. "It means technically you still own 1/3 of Monroe Industrial Solutions." I felt the blood rush to my ears. "They cut me off, fired me, lied about me." Nora's tone stayed calm. "And that's why you keep your proof. Don't contact them yet. Let's gather everything. If they violated procedure, they're vulnerable." Vulnerable. That word echoed in my chest like a pulse. I went home that night and told Evan everything. He listened quietly, his eyes wide but proud. "So, you could take it back?" he asked. I shook my head slowly. "Not take it back, not yet. I could challenge them, make them nervous, force them to see me again." He smiled. "You sound dangerous." "I hope so." From that night forward, my apartment became my war room. The kitchen table was buried under stacks of old reports, highlighted contracts, sticky notes, and spreadsheets. Every late night I'd once spent fixing their mistakes was now spent analyzing them. And in those hours of deep silence, I realized something crucial. My father and brother had been slowly sinking the company without even realizing it. They'd over-leveraged for expansion, taken out high-interest business loans, and missed several compliance filings that could trigger penalties. They were standing on a house of cards. And I knew exactly which one to pull. Still, I wasn't ready to strike. Not yet. Revenge, I told myself, isn't rage, it's timing. I began reaching out to contacts discreetly. Old vendors, suppliers, even 1 or 2 clients who still respected me. I didn't tell them what I was planning, just that I was starting something new. Most of them said the same thing. "If you ever open your own firm, Jessica, we'll follow you." That planted another seed, one that would grow into something much bigger. Because maybe the best way to destroy Monroe Industrial wasn't to burn it down. Maybe it was to build something stronger right beside it, and let it collapse under its own weight. That realization hit me one night while staring at the city lights from our balcony. The same skyline my father used to admire, boasting about how he built this town. He didn't build it. People like me did. And I was done building for someone else. I turned to Evan and said, "I'm not going to fight for my place at their table." He raised an eyebrow. "No?" I smiled. "No, I'm going to build a new one, and make sure they're the ones begging for a seat. They say revenge is best served cold. But mine? Mine was forged slow, like tempered steel. After Nora confirmed the validity of my claim, I didn't rush into filing paperwork or storming into boardrooms demanding recognition. That's what they expected. A loud emotional outburst they could dismiss as hysteria. No, I was going to do what I'd always done best. Be quiet, strategic, and utterly precise. The first step was information. If I wanted to win, truly win, I needed to know exactly where Monroe Industrial stood. Their weaknesses, their debts, their exposure. So I started where I'd always started, with numbers. Every morning I'd take my coffee, open my laptop, and comb through public filings. Corporate tax statements, permit approvals, supplier contracts. All of it was public record if you knew where to look. And I did. Within a week, patterns started to emerge. Monroe Industrial was overextended, severely. They'd opened 3 new regional branches in under 18 months, all financed through short-term loans. They'd secured government contracts but failed to meet supply deadlines, triggering penalty clauses that cost hundreds of thousands. Worse, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. They'd started using off-brand suppliers. Cheap materials, Daniel's cost-saving measures. That might have impressed shareholders for a quarter or two, but long-term, it was poison. One lawsuit, one construction accident, and the whole empire could crumble. I started taking notes. Meticulous, time-stamped notes. Every irregularity, every gap in their filings, every public complaint. It wasn't about gossip. It was about building a case. Nora helped me draft a silent inquiry, a legal notice requesting clarification on my removal as an officer. It didn't accuse them of wrongdoing. It simply asked for documentation proving my voluntary withdrawal. Of course, no such documentation existed. Don't send it yet, Nora warned. You only get one shot to make them panic. Let's make sure when it hits, it lands like a hammer. So I waited. I watched. Meanwhile, I started putting my second plan into motion, my own company. It was Evan's idea, actually. One night, we were eating takeout in the living room, cold noodles, TV on mute, when he said, "You could do this better than them, Jess. You know that, right?" I smiled tiredly. Maybe, but I'd need funding, a network, clients. He leaned forward. You already have all that. They just don't realize it. He was right. I called a few old vendors. People I'd always treated fairly. People who trusted me more than they ever trusted my brother. I didn't mention revenge. I just said I was starting a boutique procurement firm focused on ethical sourcing and efficiency. To my surprise, almost everyone said the same thing. Jessica, if you're behind it, we're in. In 2 months. I filed for registration. Everline Supply Cupboard, a simple name, but strong, clean, independent. Evan helped me set up the website, and Nora made sure every document was airtight. No loopholes, no weak points. I wasn't just building a business, I was building a weapon. Once Everline was operational, I started bidding for small contracts, the kind Monroe Industrial used to ignore. Affordable housing, school renovations, eco-friendly projects. I kept my margins slim but my reliability flawless. Within 6 months, we were gaining traction. And then it happened. My first major client. A construction firm in the same region where Monroe Industrial had just failed to deliver a shipment reached out. Their message was short. We heard you used to work with Monroe. We're switching suppliers. Can you handle 50K units monthly? I smiled so hard it hurt. Yes, I replied. I can handle it. By the time the ink dried on that contract, Monroe Industrial had already lost nearly $200,000 in penalties from missed deadlines. I didn't need to sabotage them. They were doing that to themselves. All I had to do was exist. Still, the time for silence was nearly over. Once Everline hit profitability, I sat down with Nora again. We reviewed the original officer agreement, the company's restructuring filings, and the missing consent forms. Nora leaned back in her chair. It's time, she said. If you want to file, we can submit an ownership claim. It'll force them to respond publicly. I hesitated. That'll make it war. She met my gaze. They declared war when they erased you. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk, the same hard drive glowing beside me, thinking about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the humiliation, the months of rebuilding myself from ashes. And then quietly, I wrote an email. Not to my family, but to the corporate registrar's office. To whom it may concern, I am writing to dispute the validity of the Monroe Industrial Solutions restructuring filed under entity number ACUR M8742C. As an active officer and partner at the time of filing, I was neither informed nor did I provide consent, as required by Clause 7.2 of the corporate charter. Attached are supporting documents and a copy of the original officer agreement. Sincerely, Jessica Monroe. It wasn't dramatic. No exclamation marks. No threats. Just quiet precision. The kind my father never saw coming. I didn't tell anyone I'd sent it. Not even Evan. I just waited. 2 weeks later, Nora called. Her voice was calm but tinged with excitement. They responded. My heart raced. What did they say? They're nervous. Their legal team's asking for a meeting to resolve the misunderstanding. That means they know they're exposed. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling for the first time in days. Good, let them sweat. But I wasn't finished. While they scrambled, I had another idea, one that would seal their fate. Remember those cheap suppliers Daniel had been using? One of them had just been flagged for safety violations. A major one. I had contacts in the Department of Labor, and with a single tip, an anonymous one, I could trigger a full inspection. I didn't falsify anything. I didn't lie. I just made sure the truth found the right ears, and within a month, it did. The investigation hit Monroe Industrial like a wrecking ball. Orders delayed, contracts suspended, reputations bruised, and right on cue, Everline Supply Co. Reliable, transparent, fully certified, was ready to step in. It wasn't just poetic justice. It was perfect timing. The irony, Daniel still didn't realize I was behind it. He thought some new competitor was just stealing their market share. My name hadn't appeared publicly in months. They still believed I was gone. Meanwhile, Nora was preparing for the next move, the legal strike that would make everything official. I remember her saying, Jessica, once we file this claim in court, it'll go public. Your father will have no choice but to face you. I nodded, my expression calm, almost detached. Good. I want him to see me when it happens. She smiled. You're not scared? Not anymore. Because by then, I'd realized something profound. Revenge wasn't about hurting them. It was about reclaiming my power, about reminding them that the woman they'd underestimated had been the backbone of everything they'd built. While they partied, I plotted. While they signed deals, I wrote the terms that would undo them. While they cut me off, I built a new foundation, brick by brick, clause by clause. And soon, they'd watch it all unfold, not with fury, but with disbelief. Because by the time they saw my name again, it would be written on the papers that owned them. Execution day didn't come with trumpets. It came with a mail courier, a gavel, and a meeting invite that Daniel misread as routine. That was the beauty of it. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late. Nora moved faster than I ever thought possible. The reinstatement claim we'd filed on my behalf had rattled Monroe's lawyers more than I expected. They tried to stall, then to belittle, calling me disgruntled and sentimental. But the registrar's office found procedural irregularities in the way my removal and the subsequent restructuring had been executed. The court issued a temporary reinstatement of my shareholder rights pending a full hearing. That temporary order was all I needed. The first thing Nora did was secure an emergency injunction preventing Monroe from transferring or encumbering assets and from making any executive decisions that required unanimous officer consent. Basically, freeze. No new loans, no new branch openings, no asset sales. Daniel panicked. He called a flurry of emergency meetings, but the boardroom felt different that day. Whispers instead of laughter, guarded smiles instead of swagger. I watched him on the security camera feed Nora had obtained for the case file, hands trembling as he flipped through printouts, face pale, gestures clipped. It was a private feed from the building security system. I had legal access now because the court allowed me back in as an officer for the purpose of inspection. For 12 years I'd walked these hallways. Now I watched, invisible but present, like a ghost who'd finally learned to haunt properly. With the injunction in place, I had legal standing. I could call for an emergency audit, and I did. Nora and I presented a list of items to be reviewed. The off-brand supplier contracts, the government contract penalty clauses, undisclosed short-term loans, and questionable change orders that inflated costs. The auditors started asking questions nobody wanted to answer. Suppliers were subpoenaed, lenders were notified, The company's cash flow, which Daniel had papered over with optimistic forecasts, began to unravel in real time. While the legal pressure mounted, Everline moved. We were ready to fill the gap Monroe's failing reputation was creating. We ramped up production, redirected inventory to the projects Monroe was now failing, and honored delivery windows no matter how tight the margins. Our clients were grateful and vocal. One by one, local contractors who had long relied on Monroe signed letters to the court, attesting to the penalties and delays they'd experienced. Those letters weren't gossip, they were evidence. The bank was the turning point. Monroe had taken an emergency line of credit to keep the new branches afloat. The lender included covenants requiring timely audits and compliance with certain supplier safety standards. With the Department of Labor kicking off inspections and auditors knocking at the door, Monroe breached its covenants. The bank issued a formal notice demanding immediate remediation. Monroe didn't have the liquidity. At that point, the stress switched from surprise to crisis. The board convened a stormy session. Voices rose, accusations flew. Daniel blamed vendors. My father, stoic at first, finally cracked in a way that hadn't happened since I was a child. He looked at me, in the flesh, not in court documents. And for an instant I saw the man who taught me the difference between a bolt and a rivet. Then he turned away. Nora handed me the next piece of the plan, a demand for an emergency shareholder vote to appoint a special oversight committee, a normal corporate mechanism when business risk is high. As an officer with an active claim, I could call the vote. The committee would be staffed by independent advisors. They would have authority to implement cost controls, replace vendors, and negotiate with lenders. In plain language, they could stop the bleeding. On the day of the vote, the conference room where we'd signed off on payroll memos and vendor deals felt like a courtroom. The air smelled of coffee and fear. Employees hovered by the doors, watching the executives enter like spectators at a duel. Daniel tried to rally the younger executives. "This is temporary," he insisted. "We'll come back stronger." His words sounded thin. When the votes were counted, the independent committee was approved. The auditors were empowered. Vendors were suspended pending review. Orders were put on hold. Monroe's revenue stream hiccuped deeper and deeper. That's when creditors started whispering about foreclosure. A major municipal contract was in jeopardy, a school renovation for which Monroe had already been paid a significant deposit. With delivery failures mounting, the city threatened to cancel and seek penalties. Contractors began to file liens. Board members who had long enjoyed the perks of ownership now found themselves facing liability. With the company's valuation plummeting and lenders insisting on an immediate capital injection, the board had two realistic options: find an outside investor at distressed terms, or sell assets to cover liabilities. I'd planned for this. Nora and I had quietly lined up a consortium of local investors, small, patient, principled people the company's PR machine had ignored for years. Their offer was simple and clean: an asset purchase that would ensure continued jobs, protect local contracts, and stabilize the supply chain. In exchange, they required Monroe to divest certain divisions and enter a structured buyout. In layman's terms, sell the core assets to safe hands or risk bankruptcy where nobody wins. When I presented the offer to the board as part of the committee's recommendation, Daniel stood up like a boxer. "You want to sell my family's legacy to strangers?" he shouted. The room froze. My father's hands clenched on the table. For the first time, I heard the panic in his voice. "Legacy?" I replied quietly. "Legacy doesn't include unpaid vendors or a raft of legal notices. Legacy doesn't mean people lose pensions because someone wanted to impress investors." My words were calm, but Nora had prepared the numbers: client testimonials, audited shortfalls, and a purchase offer that guaranteed jobs and preserved the brand's best assets. It was cleaner than any of us expected. The vote wasn't even close. Board members who had once deferred to Daniel now saw the arithmetic. They voted for stability. The sale closed within weeks. Monroe transferred the most stable branches and supply contracts into a new holding company controlled by the investor consortium. The terms included a clause I had insisted on. Any executive found to have acted negligently in breach of fiduciary duty would forfeit certain post-sale compensations. It was accountability written in cold legal language, and the final act, the most delicious, happened in the closing room. My name went on the buyout documents as part of the approval process. It was not the headline moment of a takeover, but the quiet, literal sign-off that made it official. Daniel's face flushed as he realized what that meant. The branches he loved were no longer his to control, and the checks he had expected to write would now be controlled by the new board. As the ink dried, I felt an odd mix of triumph and fatigue. There was no gloating. There was the sound of pens scratching against paper, phones buzzing, a janitor sweeping dust into a bin. Nearby, employees whispered that they'd keep their jobs. Someone laughed nervously. A woman from operations, the one who used to bring me coffee when the nights got long, caught my eye and mouthed, "Thank you." Daniel walked out of the room without saying goodbye. My father stood by the window for a long time, staring at the yard where, as a boy, I'd helped him stack pallets. He didn't look at me. When I finally stepped outside, the autumn sun felt sharp and honest. Evan took my hand without saying anything. He didn't need to. I hadn't burned them. I hadn't ruined the company out of spite. I'd stabilized what mattered, and removed the people who'd been reckless with other people's livelihoods. In the end, justice wore a suit and a stapler, messy, bureaucratic, effective. As we walked to the car, a reporter asked for a comment. I gave the same response I'd rehearsed with Nora. Businesses that value transparency survive. Those that value ego don't. It was vague, but it landed. Behind us, employees went back to their stations. The phone lines buzzed. Monroe, the name, would survive in some form. But the people who had cut me off for choosing love were now facing the consequences of their choices. They'd wanted me gone. Instead, they woke up to a new reality where I had the leverage, the partners, and the patience to make them answer for what they'd done. And in a drawer in my purse that I kept for important things, I slid in the final paperwork, the clause that guaranteed that certain executives would not benefit from the sale. It felt like placing the last brick in a wall I'd been building for months. The look on Daniel's face the next time our paths crossed, stunned, hollowed. That was the payoff people don't talk about. It wasn't about money. It was about recognition, about being seen. He'd underestimated me. That would be his lasting lesson. The morning after the sale closed, I woke up before dawn. For the first time in years, I didn't have to rush anywhere. No emails screaming for signatures. No deadlines waiting like wolves outside the door. The apartment was quiet. Evan was still asleep, his hand resting across my waist. The early light was slipping through the blinds, catching the edge of the plant we'd bought when I first lost my job. A little fiddle leaf fig that had somehow survived all the chaos. I got up, made coffee, and stood by the window watching the city wake. For months, my life had been fueled by motion, research, filings, strategy, tension. Now in the stillness, the weight of it all hit me. The victory, the cost. The sheer emotional gravity of tearing down something that had once been my entire world. I thought about my father. About all the times he'd lectured me on loyalty, while quietly grooming my brother to take everything. I thought about the way his voice had cracked in the boardroom, the tremor in his hands as the papers were signed. There was satisfaction there, yes, but also something else. A quiet, dull ache that no court order or contract could cure. Evan came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. "You did it," he murmured into my hair. I nodded. "I know. How do you feel?" I took a long breath before answering. Lighter, but different. Like I've been running on adrenaline for so long that I forgot what calm feels like. He smiled softly. "Calm looks good on you." I turned and looked at him. The man they'd called beneath me. The man who'd stood by me when everyone else disappeared. "You were my one good decision," I said quietly. He kissed my forehead. "You were your own best decision, Jess." Later that week, Nora and I met for coffee to tie up the final details. She handed me a sealed envelope, my official ownership certificate for Everline Supply Co. "You're fully clear," she said. "Profitable, debt-free, and independent," I laughed softly. "That's more than I can say for Monroe Industrial." Her expression softened. "They'll survive in some form. Your father's still there, but he's no longer in control. The investors respect what you did, even the ones who won't admit it." I didn't do it for their respect, I said, stirring my coffee. I did it so I could look in the mirror and not see someone who let herself be erased. Nora smiled. You did more than that. You built something that stands on your own name. When she left, I sat there for a while, sipping the last of my latte as the city hummed outside. That was when it truly sank in. I didn't just win. I changed. For years, I'd lived in the shadow of my family's expectations. I was the quiet one, the fixer, the one who stayed late and smoothed over their mistakes. They thought that made me weak, but that same patience, that same attention to detail, it became my weapon. My strength. The victory wasn't in watching them fall. It was in standing again, tall, unshaken, unbent, when they thought I never would. A few weeks later, I went back to the old headquarters for a final inspection. I didn't need to. The paperwork was done, the deal closed, but I needed closure. Walking through the lobby felt like walking through a memory. The marble floors still gleamed, the reception desk still smelled faintly of lemon polish. But the air was different, lighter. There were new people at the front desk, unfamiliar faces who smiled politely as I passed. Upstairs, the office that had once been mine was now empty. The walls were bare except for a faint outline where my nameplate used to be. I stood there for a long time, remembering the girl who used to sit at that desk, nervous, eager, trying so hard to earn her father's approval. She was gone now, and in her place stood a woman who didn't need anyone's permission to belong. I ran my fingers over the cool glass of the window, watching the city below, cranes, trucks, people moving, building, living. For years I'd been part of that world, but never truly in it. Now, it felt like it belonged to me in a way it never had before. On my way out, I saw my father. He was in the corridor, speaking quietly with one of the new managers. His hair looked grayer, his shoulders heavier. When he saw me, he froze. For a moment, neither of us said a word. Then he cleared his throat. Jessica. Dad. He looked at the floor, then back up. You did well. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't love. But it was something. A flicker of acknowledgement in a man who had spent his whole life pretending he didn't make mistakes. Thank you, I said simply. He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then turned and walked away. I didn't follow, because I didn't need to hear it anymore. Outside, the sun was low, painting the parking lot gold. Evan was waiting by the car, leaning against the hood, smiling when he saw me. I walked toward him, feeling the warmth of the light on my face, the steady rhythm of my footsteps on the pavement. Did you get what you needed? He asked as I reached him. I looked back at the building one last time, the place that had shaped me, hurt me, tested me. Yeah, I said. I finally did. We drove home with the windows down. The air smelled like spring, clean, full of new beginnings. That night, I sat at my desk, opened a fresh journal, and wrote the first entry I'd written for myself in years. They wanted me gone. Now they're the ones without a chair. Justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears a business suit and reads the fine print. I closed the journal and smiled. I didn't need revenge anymore. I'd already moved past it. I had a company to run, people to lead, and a life to live. One that wasn't built on bitterness, but on purpose. Sometimes, I still think about that day they cut me off. The shock, the humiliation, the ache. But when I do, I don't feel pain anymore. I feel gratitude, because that was the day I stopped trying to be what they wanted, and started becoming who I was meant to be. Evan calls it fate. I call it evolution. Either way, it was worth every scar. Vindication doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it comes quietly, like sunlight creeping into a room that's been dark for too long. It was about 6 months after the buyout when I finally felt it, the full weight of what I'd accomplished. Everline Supply Commerce wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. We'd grown from a handful of clients to over 50 regular contracts. The same vendors who once turned their backs on me were now calling to partner. Our reputation for transparency and efficiency spread faster than I ever expected. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a local entrepreneurship conference. The topic was building integrity in family-owned businesses. The irony didn't escape me. I stood backstage, listening to the moderator introduce me. Jessica Monroe, founder and CEO of Everline Supply Co., a fast-rising leader in ethical construction sourcing. My hands were steady. My voice, when I spoke, carried none of the tremor it once had. I told my story. Not the revenge, not the lawsuits, not the betrayal, but the lesson. I learned that loyalty is only a virtue when it's mutual, I said. And sometimes the people who raise you can't see your strength until you stop asking for their approval. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then applause, loud, genuine, not out of sympathy, but respect. That was vindication. Not in headlines, not in money, but in knowing that my name finally stood for something I built. A few weeks later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was Daniel. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. But curiosity won. "Jessica," he said. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." "I almost didn't," I said truthfully. There was a long pause. I wanted to say, "You won." Fair and square, I stayed silent. I could tell he was struggling to say the next part. "I messed up," he said finally. "Dad, he's not doing well. He barely comes to the office anymore. People blame me for everything. Maybe they should. The old me would have softened. The old me would have said, 'It's okay, we'll fix this together.' But that woman didn't exist anymore." "I didn't do this to destroy you, Daniel," I said quietly. "I did it to save myself." "I know," he said. "I just thought, maybe one day we could talk, not as enemies." I didn't promise him anything, but I didn't hang up either. Sometimes, silence is its own kind of mercy. After that call, I found myself thinking about my father again. I hadn't seen him since that day in the hallway. So one Sunday afternoon, I drove to his house. The place looked smaller somehow. The once perfect lawn was patchy, the paint on the shutters peeling. When he opened the door, he looked surprised and older. "Jessica," he said softly. "Hi, Dad." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he gestured for me to come in. The living room was exactly as I remembered. Shelves lined with trophies, photos of Daniel's graduation, family vacations where I was always half cropped out. "I heard you're doing well," he said finally, sitting down. "I am." He nodded slowly. "Good, you deserve that." The words were simple, but coming from him, they carried weight. "I wanted to hate you for a long time," I admitted. But then I realized, if you hadn't pushed me out, I'd still be there, waiting for your approval. I'd never have built something of my own. He looked at me for a long time, eyes glassy. "You were always the smart one. I just didn't see it because you didn't fight like Daniel. You were quiet. I mistook quiet for weak." "You weren't the only one," I said. He sighed. "I was wrong. About a lot of things. It wasn't an apology in the way I once wanted it, but it was enough. Sometimes, enough is all you get, and it's all you need." Before I left, he walked me to the door. "Take care of yourself, Jess," he said softly. "I will," I said. "You too." As I drove away, I didn't cry. I didn't feel bitterness either. Just peace, the kind that comes after a long storm, when you finally realize you've made it through. Everline continued to grow. We opened 2 new branches, one in Denver, one in Chicago. I hired people who reminded me of myself, smart, quiet workers who had been overlooked. Our motto became simple: build with integrity. One afternoon, while I was reviewing proposals, Evan walked into my office holding a small box. "You've been working non-stop," he said with that mischievous smile of his. "Take a break." Inside the box was a tiny gold plaque that read, "From rock bottom to CEO, never forget who you are." I laughed, tears threatening the corners of my eyes. "You're such a sap," I said, but my voice cracked. He grinned. Maybe, but I'm proud of you. We hung the plaque right above my desk. Every time I looked at it, I felt that fire again. Not of revenge, but of purpose. A few months later, Monroe Industrial filed for restructuring. The press wrote polite headlines. Legacy company rebrands under new management. But those who knew the truth understood. It was the end of an era. Daniel resigned quietly. My father retired. The company that once shut me out now called to offer partnership deals. I declined, politely but firmly, because I had moved beyond them, and that, more than any courtroom victory or headline, was vindication. One evening, I was invited to the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new community center, one funded in part by Everline's charitable initiative. The building gleamed under the lights, and the air buzzed with hope. As I stood on the stage beside Evan, I saw faces in the crowd. Workers, families, people who'd benefited from the project. When the ribbon fell, the applause rose like a wave. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of it wash over me. This was what success was supposed to feel like. Not power, not vengeance, fulfillment. Evan leaned over and whispered, "So, was it worth it?" I smiled. Every second, he squeezed my hand. "Then it's time to stop looking back." "I already have," I said. As the crowd cheered and cameras flashed, I realized something quietly beautiful. I had become the kind of woman my younger self needed. Strong, unshaken, and unafraid to start over. I had built my own name, my own legacy, my own peace. And somewhere, deep down, I hoped my family, wherever they were, whatever they thought, finally understood that cutting me off didn't end me. It created me. It's strange. When people hear my story now, they always ask the same thing. "Jessica, do you ever wish it had gone differently?" And I always smile, because the truth is, no, not one bit. If they hadn't betrayed me, I never would have discovered who I was without them. If they hadn't cut me off, I never would have built something entirely my own. Pain was the price of clarity, and I'd pay it again if it meant ending up here. But this isn't just my story. It's for anyone who's ever been underestimated, undervalued, or told they're too quiet to lead. It's for the people who gave everything to someone else's dream, only to be left standing alone when the lights went out. Because here's the thing no one tells you. Sometimes, losing everything you thought you needed is exactly what clears the space for what you truly deserve. In the months after everything settled, I started journaling again. Not about revenge or business or contracts, but about peace. What it feels like to wake up without fear. What it feels like to build a life not from anger, but from choice. One of my first entries was simple. Power doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from controlling your own story. That became my new mantra, the foundation for everything I did after. I began mentoring young women in business, especially those from family-run companies who felt trapped in the same cycles of silence I'd lived through. Every time I saw one of them find her voice, I felt that spark again, that reminder that my pain had purpose. Everline became more than a business. It became a movement. We funded scholarships for women in finance and engineering, created mentorship programs for underrepresented founders, and launched a sustainability initiative that cut waste in our supply chain by 40%. It wasn't just about proving I could build what they said I couldn't. It was about using that strength to lift others who were still fighting their own quiet wars. Sometimes, when I drive past the old Monroe Industrial Warehouse, the one that still bears our family name, I feel a strange calm. There's no bitterness anymore. Just history. Like an old scar, visible but no longer painful. The woman I was back then. The loyal, eager daughter desperate to be seen. She wouldn't recognize the woman I am now. And that's the point. Growth isn't supposed to make you recognizable. It's supposed to make you whole. There's a quote I keep framed in my office, right beside the gold plaque Evan gave me. They buried us. They didn't know we were seeds. Every time I read it, I think of that day, the day they erased my name, took my key card, and told me I wasn't part of the family anymore. I remember standing in the parking lot, holding a cardboard box filled with 12 years of my life, and thinking it was the end. Turns out, it was just the planting. Because from that dirt, from that betrayal, came everything. The company. The peace, the purpose. And that's what I want anyone listening to take from my story. Don't be afraid when people shut doors in your face. Sometimes those doors aren't meant to open again. Sometimes they're meant to show you where the exit is, so you can find the room that's truly yours. I get messages now, hundreds of them, from women and men who've watched the story of the daughter who bought her family's company and found courage in it. Some call it poetic justice, some call it revenge, but I call it rebirth. Because revenge dies the moment you win. But rebirth, that lives forever. A few weeks ago, I was invited to speak at a gala for young entrepreneurs. The theme was resilience in the face of failure. As I stood under the stage lights, looking out at rows of people chasing their own uncertain futures, I realized something. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It never really had been. It was about reclaiming authorship, writing my own ending instead of letting someone else narrate it for me. So I told them the truth. No fancy metaphors, no corporate slogans. Just this. When they betrayed me, I didn't break. I recalculated. When they erased me, I didn't disappear. I rewrote the record. When they underestimated me, I didn't argue. I built proof. And the audience, hundreds of faces lit with possibility, rose to their feet. Not for the drama. Not for the scandal. But for the truth. Now, on quiet nights, when Evan and I sit on our balcony with a glass of wine, watching the city hum below us, I sometimes smile and say, "Do you remember when they said we wouldn't last?" He laughs, every time. I do. I should send them a thank you card. Why's that? Because if they hadn't pushed you out, the world never would have met this Jessica. And maybe he's right. Maybe the people who hurt us aren't villains after all. Maybe they're the unintentional architects of our awakening. Because the day they cut me off was the day I stopped being part of their story and started writing my own. So if you've ever been betrayed, dismissed, or told you're not enough, remember this. The people who try to bury you are often the ones who water your roots without realizing it. When they doubt you, smile. When they push you out, build your own door. And when they tell you it's over, whisper quietly, "Watch me." Because one day they'll look up and realize the person they tried to break has become the one signing their checks, setting their standards, and living free of their control. That's not vengeance. That's vindication. And as for me, my family cut me off for choosing love. But in the end, love, integrity, and resilience built an empire they could never take from me. And that right there is the sweetest victory of all.